There's an unbelievable amount of innovation happening, in education. And, AI, if you think about all the conversation that's happening around AI, education is often cited as, frankly, one of the core use cases. I'm really excited, actually, about where it's going to go, assuming that we all take the right steps to avoid the dystopian, future that you also painted.
Will education in 10 or 20 years look dramatically different? And if so, what do you think it will look like?
And I think there's a few elements of change that we envision here that we're seeing. One is certainly that...
What are kind of some of the most interesting kinds of AI EdTech startups you're seeing recently?
It's a really exciting time. There's just a lot of different solutions that are coming to market. That's where technology really is going to shine. We just think that that's an exciting world.
In this episode of Next Unicorn Podcast, I talk with Chiu, one of the managing directors of Owl Ventures, the largest EdTech or education technology venture capital firm in the world, with over $2 billion under management. In this interview, we talk about the future of education and EdTech. We discuss how technology will dramatically change many areas of education, how AI can be harnessed as a positive force in education, and how students of the future will learn. We talk about some of the startups at the cutting edge of EdTech and how our concept of education may be very different in the future. Later in the interview, we also discuss Ian's personal career background. Also, stick around to the end because Ian participates in the Next Unicorn bonus round. Tell us briefly about Owl Ventures and what makes it unique among venture capital firms and among venture capital firms that specialize in EdTech or education technology.
Yeah, Owl was launched with the sole purpose of scaling the world's most promising EdTech companies. We launched when the sector was in its nascency, and we were fortunate to partner with groups who shared our vision in supporting students globally, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as founding LPs. Fast forward 10 years now, we're the largest venture growth fund focused exclusively on education. So we're managing a little bit over $2.25 billion across our funds. About 100 companies around the world in our portfolio focused on delivering the promise of technology to improve education. We're stage flexible in our mandate. So we're investing from seed through growth and global. We have the ability to sort of scale up anywhere, relative to the company's headquarters, their company's reach, size, and stage. And as an organization, we really view ourselves as being purpose-built to help EdTech companies. So what does that mean? That means that our LPs, they're incredibly strategic in our relationships with our companies. Many of them are universities that are using products that we're investing in. Some of them are sovereign wealths. We also have nonprofits, that are very aligned in not only the K-12 side, but also the workforce side and what we're doing. Our team is exclusively focused as well in terms of our own experience and networks in the space over many, many years. And the services that we deliver, the value-added portfolio services that we deliver to our companies are really geared for EdTech. And so we'll have exclusive sort of roundtables, strategic conversations, discussions around selling into schools, as an example, or into learning leaders at an enterprise level. And we also have a team of outcomes and operationally focused partners specific to EdTech. And so, as an example, most recently, we added the former CEO of Dreambox Learning, Jesse Woolley Wilson, as an operating partner here at the firm. We hold a strong view that delivering impact and outcomes in education are pretty foundational to the commercial success of EdTech businesses. And so, in that regard, we really invest in that capability. And so one of our partners, Malvika Bhagwat, who is a partner here at the firm, is fully dedicated, not only to helping us evaluate, but also helping our companies deliver on that. And so that can be seen on our website. We have a annual outcomes report that folks can check out and get a sense for what we're thinking about and what our companies are delivering.
And more specifically, what are the Owl Ventures investment theses around EdTech or education technology?
Yeah, I mean, we've always invested behind the North Star thesis that there would be a digital transformation happening in the education sector. And, frankly, that's happened far faster than we ever imagined, even at the beginning. Obviously, at some level to the last few years with COVID accelerating a lot of that. We started in our first fund with a focus on US K-12. We then entered into higher education and adult learning / future of work. And over the last 5 years, we've really expanded to invest globally and also in EdTech Plus, which we view as the intersection of education and other major sectors. So just in the past year, in fact, we did launch our first global office in London as well, and we now have team members on the ground in Europe. And so our strategy has always been to invest in the very best EdTech companies, leverage our network resources, our experience to help entrepreneurs build and scale these transformational companies. And our belief is that as a specialist dedicated fund to the category, we have the resources and global reach that's going to be ideal, to help companies that are focused in this specific sector to deliver on their vision.
What kinds of EdTech startups are you currently focused on?
Yeah, there's a lot of themes that we're focused on within EdTech. Just to name a few within K-12, certainly there are reading and math solutions to help address learning loss. We've invested in tools that alleviate teacher workloads. Student mental health is a big theme as well, particularly over the last couple of years. Within post-secondary and workforce, the skilling and upskilling for both white-collar and blue-collar workers is a very, very long-term theme that we're investing behind. There's also tools, certainly, to help deliver online learning for institutions. And then there's, I think, broader categories. If you think about lifelong learning, so language learning certainly falls into that bucket as well. And so we have a few companies that are focused on language learning and lifelong learning, sort of generally speaking, as well.
What are just some examples briefly of some of the EdTech startups in your investment portfolio at Owl Ventures? And just very briefly, what do they do?
Yeah, so just to kind of name a few across a few buckets, Newsela is a K-12 solution that's empowering teachers to select the very best content for their students. And so Newsela really levels the reading content appropriate to where the student is and allows the teacher to really assign the same reading to a classroom that may have a variance in terms of reading levels within the classroom, but Newsela then normalizes for those levels for the students. They're doing that now, delivering that for over 42 million students across the U.S. Kiddom is another company. And so, as we know now, what we're seeing sort of today, schools and districts are using a number of different point solutions to kind of create, approach, and track progress. A ton of those are in the form of school curriculum and assessment. And Kiddom really kind of consolidates all of that into one platform to not only help partner districts save on budget, but also to get invaluable data on student learning. At the adult side, we have a company called Interplay Learning, and they are focused on skilling and upskilling in the trades. So you can think about HVAC, plumbing, electrical, facilities maintenance. Interplay is delivering simulation training that can be accessible both through mobile as well as desktop, laptop, and then if available, VR as well. And all of that is to train skilled trade workers within residential and commercial. A couple of others. Hazel Health is a really interesting one. There's 20 million children in the U.S. that lack sufficient access to healthcare, and Hazel is partnering today with school nurse offices within K-12 public schools and health plans, and they're really delivering high quality telehealth both for physical and mental wellness to students across the nation. And then the last, to give you a sense for international opportunity that we're invested in, Leap Finance is focused on students that are seeking to study overseas, helping them to select the right university, identify ways to finance the education, securing visas, and then also just creating a community for those students to really have interactions with others that are along the same journey. And so they've really grown tremendously as well over the last couple of years.
Awesome. So this sounds like a really wide range of education and education technology related startups in different verticals. Let's move on and talk about the future of education. Is the current method of education broken and outdated? And will education in 10 or 20 years look dramatically different? And if so, what do you think it will look like?
Yeah, great question. I think, to us, the goal of education, it's always been to help nurture and develop, healthy, productive members of society. But, as we know, society in the world is always changing. And frankly, it's changing even more rapidly now than ever before, right? And so if you just think about the world where you and I were growing up, we probably didn't have internet access, growing up, and right until around the time that, frankly, I started college. And, as we look around what's happening today, the educators, the institutions of learning are also evolving now, not only to match sort of what is being taught, how those things are being taught, but even who they are teaching. So, for example, you can think about how do you prepare for those future skills? What are you sort of delivering in terms of the modality of the teaching? Is it sort of a one size fits all, or do you have opportunities for students to engage in a hybrid type of format? And increasingly, you're starting to see as well, and this has certainly been over the last several decades, but more and more adult learning, is becoming the norm. And that is also a function of just how quickly the world is changing. I think the sort of mentality or the framework paradigm of going to K through 12, perhaps, achieving or earning a degree of some kind, and then finding your way into a company for the next 30 years without having to go back and reskill or upskill is completely in the past. And now we're just seeing a continuous kind of learning and iteration, for not only younger kids, but also, of course, adults as we progress through our careers. And teachers are clearly critical in all of that. And we really believe that, learners, frankly, are at the center of it all as well. And, for OWL, it's always been that investment in innovation in the education system can help, our institutions and teachers better prepare learners for the world that they're entering. And so that takes many forms, right? It takes the form of increasing efficiencies for the teachers and helping them, again, accomplish some of the work that they're doing in a more automated manner so that they can spend more time where the student need the most help in terms of that direct interaction, getting an idea better of which students need what help, before actually spending that time. These are all things that, technology and EdTech solutions, are delivering on today, and really kind of preparing students for, again, a more sort of ever-changing and digital world.
It seems like, millennials and Gen X generations are increasingly skeptical of taking out massive debt for higher education. And meanwhile, companies maybe are more skills-based in their orientation of potential hires, evaluating potential hires. And seems like students in elementary and high school, et cetera, maybe feel more and more like what they're learning is not super relevant to what they'll actually ever use. How does that kind of new situation around education inform your sort of investment decisions moving forward?
Yeah, I think this gets into what do we think that, to your earlier question about what do we think that education is going to look like in 10 to 20 years. And I think there's a few elements of change that we envision here that we're seeing. One is certainly that, technology is going to increase, personalization and engagement. So you can think about all of the technology around simulations. AI is certainly providing a more tailored approach that's engaging and interactive. You have early stages of solutions that are incorporating VR, AR in terms of their learning modalities. And we're just early on in all of that, but I think over time you're going to get sort of more engagement opportunities with technology to make some of the education more sort of exciting for the students and more tailored. The second thing is around flexible learning, and so what do I mean by that? It's really learning that's happening either in person, online, hybrid. All of that will be incorporated. And just frankly, just really kind of depends on the prevailing sort of infrastructure in the communities that we're looking at, and also, the stage of learner. Certainly, older adult learners are going to have the ability to find education online to be easier to access than, say, younger kindergarten kids, as an example. But our view is really that there is room for technology here. There's, it's really much like shopping, where you can shop offline, but now that online is also so convenient, really depends on what you're solving for, what you have available in front of you, and what works best. And so project-based learning, I think you sort of talked a little bit about some of those changes that are happening in terms of how students are viewing how applicable some of the things that they're learning are. And I think we're going to start to see more and more project-based learning around particular skills as well. And so it's not just going to be rote memorization or answering multiple choice questions. I think education is going to continue to evolve. And we'll talk a little bit more, I'm sure, about the impact of AI. But I think more and more the critical thinking, the creativity, the collaboration and teamwork, and really kind of honing in on career readiness and skills is going to be a continual evolution that we're going to see in the education system. And then, as I mentioned before, there is going to be really, I think, a premium placed on lifelong. And so education isn't really just going to stop at 12th grade or when you have a degree of some kind. It's really going to be continuous and lifelong. And enterprises are increasingly a big part of the puzzle, as well, in terms of the employee skilling and upskilling and ongoing learning.
How do you think about the future of education by level? For example, kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, higher ed, continuing learning, as you mentioned. And what do you think the future of education for each of those levels will look like, briefly?
Yeah, just briefly touching on that. I mean, I think at the preschool and below level, the biggest change there is just going to be the continued recognition that more children should have access to it. The efficacy of preschool education, is well researched. There's more funding that's coming to provide that, as well. And I think it's important for obvious reasons around socialization skills, cognitive, abilities around learning some of the basics, before entering into the former K-12 school system. And then also just having, more familiarity with some of the, again, technologies that are available. But of course, at that age level, we're probably not really sort of overemphasizing, tech as much in that regard. And it's really more about getting familiar with the environment and, some of the social skills as well. And then as you get into K-12, as mentioned, I think there's going to be more around project-based learning and collaborative activities. We're seeing that right now already, because some of the assignments that teachers will give out even a couple of years ago, would be difficult to do so today without, students easily sort of accessing the technology and, ChatGPT and other AI solutions. You can't really rely strictly on, again, like sort of call and response or like multiple choice type of questions. It's got to be a bit more, I think, evolved and involved in terms of what's being asked of the students. Digital literacy and technology literacy, I think, is going to rise alongside traditional academic subjects like math and reading. There's going to be, again, more choices in terms of other modalities of learning. And I think importantly in all of this, by the way, I think teachers are going to need to have more opportunities, and the education institutions are going to need to provide more opportunities for professional development. Because again, as employees of companies are continuously learning, teachers in many ways also are doing that right now, and educational institutions will need to continue to provide them with the training to be able to teach the digital and technology literacy alongside those traditional subjects. And I think there's going to be an emphasis as well on continued emphasis on career readiness and mental wellness that we'll start to see more and more within K-12. And then as you move into higher education and workforce, I think the emphasis on skills-based development is going to come more and more to the forefront. I think you referenced this earlier, but certainly the continued sort of rising cost of traditional four-year degrees, has been a burden on a lot of students. And for some, the ROI, hasn't all been there. But I think in many regards, like for these institutions, they are now sort of waking up to that. I think there's been a wave of sort of consolidation and closures, for some small liberal arts schools in regions where some demographic shifts have moved some of the populations away. and in even sort of some of the larger institutions of learning, we're starting to see a sort of increasing blur between what they're providing and what workforce training is doing. And I think for the better, meaning that, what they're really sort of thinking about is what do our students need to know, or what should they be capable of doing, as they enter into the workforce to be ready to contribute, to their first job, to their first employer. And so, really that goes hand in hand with delivering ROI to these students as well. I think as well, we talked a little bit about some of the things that need to happen for, higher education, traditional learning institutions, but I think we're going to continue to also see proliferation of alternate paths. So those are, boot camps or online certifications, employer learning pathways. I think, again, as I mentioned, employers are sort of increasingly a part of the equation and part of the puzzle. And they view, credentials oftentimes as equivalent to, both traditional credentialing exams or, even degrees, in some regards. Certainly certain employers are saying, hey, we don't need to necessarily filter on a degree, a 4-year degree program to essentially look for our next hire. If you complete this assessment or if you come in with some specific skills, there's an overwhelming majority of employers now that are starting to endorse, more and more of that perspective. So I think, those are some of the things that we see changing. Again, technology is going to play a big part of that. I think, again, as I mentioned, company interplay learning, I think there's going to be more simulation training, that happens, for individuals across all types of jobs. We have another company that is doing simulation training for nurses. It's a company called UBSim. And so you can just imagine for a lot of professions, more and more technology within the simulation side. You can think about it as, the flight simulator, but for each specific, sort of end role, if you will. That's going to be, I think, increasingly common as well in the future.
Does remote learning really work? And what data do we have from the whole COVID pandemic experience around remote learning? And what do we learn from that experience? And how does that impact your investment decisions moving forward?
I think that, again, we went through a lot as a world, during COVID. I think in terms of remote learning, there's varying outcomes, when you think about how did that work, and really kind of dependent on a number of factors, age, as I mentioned earlier, with older individuals or adults going to be more sort of easier to sort of educate remotely versus, say, like a kindergartner, as an example. Whether or not you have access, to the infrastructure. Do you have internet access? Do you have, the right equipment? Are the support structures there? Do you have, frankly, even something as straightforward as, do you have a quiet space, within your home to go and focus on the remote learning? And so I think it's going to vary, or it does vary depending on the situation. But in many regards, it's what we talked about before, which is that remote learning is part of the fabric or part of the options that exist out there. It's not intended in many regards. It's not intended. Nobody was planning for it to be 100% of how every single person in the world, learned 100% of the time. And that's really what we were thrust into, during COVID. But I do like to say that, remind folks that without sort of the opportunity for digital remote learning, I think we would have been in a far, far more challenging place, in terms of learning loss. Frankly, as it is, going through COVID was very challenging for many people and many students. And if you take a look at the data, the pandemic really resulted in significant learning loss. And so, students' math and reading scores saw a historic decline. There's a group called NAEP, that assesses those things. And if you look back longitudinally, the results really show a plummeting, score for, both average 4th and 8th graders. And The data really showed that the fourth graders had the largest score decline in reading since 1990. And eighth graders posted the largest decline ever in math. And again, I wouldn't attribute that to remote learning per se. I think that's a sort of overly simplistic, attribution. I would really say that it's a function of a lot of different things that happened in various communities over COVID. And, candidly, now, as a society, we're really, and here in the US, certainly for sure, we're really focused on making up time, lost time for that learning loss. And there's a lot of academics that will suggest that, hey, look, it's going to take until 2028 for students to recover. Others say it will take decades, but I think it's pretty obvious to anybody that's involved in education that we're not just going to sit around and wait for, years or decades to get this generation of students back on track, right? And so, to us, I think EdTech can play a huge role in supporting that. And so those are some of the things that have emerged in terms of investment themes for us, are topics and companies that are delivering solutions around learning loss. Again, like the mental health and wellness, as we talked about. There's significant teacher shortages that came as a result of COVID with teacher turnover. And so, at a time where the learning loss is the most, we're probably at this, concurrently facing the highest teacher shortages in many years as well. And so that's where, again, we feel that there's an opportunity for technology to help, improve, the teachers in terms of helping alleviate some of the burden of their day-to-day job that is a bit more, say, administrative or a bit more data gathering, and really kind of support and augment their efforts to help students. And then the last thing I'll just say in terms of remote learning is that there are absolutely right conditions and settings where remote learning can be very effective. And those are pretty obvious. I mean, if you look at adult learners, who are looking to gain a certification, maybe they don't happen to live within 20 or 30 minutes or so of a place to gain that certification. Maybe they also have a busy day-to-day schedule with a job and kids. And so in those conditions, remote learning is really fantastic to unlock the ability for them to gain credentials that will allow them to advance their careers. Another situation, of course, is if you look at rural areas and you have lack of teacher availability, or even in some other communities where maybe you don't have access to certain, teachers on specific subjects. We have a company called Subject, actually, that we're invested in here at OWL that is delivering a lot of those courses where, schools are accessing them where they need them to fill the gaps that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do in a physical world. And so those are, certainly an option where remote learning is also very successful. And then, of course, things that are used for supplementation to really, again, help with what's happening, in the classroom. And then you have additional support videos or other types of offerings for supplementation and after school learning, as well. And those are perfect for remote learning oftentimes.
It seems like during COVID, in addition to the learning loss during this era of remote education, there was also a lot of socialization loss, and impacts, especially on the younger kids in preschool and elementary school, and I'm sure middle school and high school as well. How do you look at this new era of an increasing technology in education, but also continuing to address that human element of socialization and in-person emotional growth, and even to address those kind of the root of those kind of mental health challenges before they even become an issue? How do you kind of weave that all together with this new era of a lot of technology and education?
Yeah, and certainly as a father of three kids, 9, 4, and 2 today, but much younger over the last couple of years, we saw the impact of that, right? You kids that weren't able to go, to school and have sort of that socialization and that important time, in person with other kids as well as with teachers. And so I think that it is really important, again, to support existing educational institutions, as well as the preschool, the preschool sector as well, and to support kids on a continuing basis for that exact reason. How does technology sort of come into that? Well, technology can come in to support that process. It's not something that's going to come in to replace in-person interaction. I think we all saw how challenging that was, during that time where, kindergartners were logging into Zoom calls, stopping, taking a break, coming back to a Zoom call, seeing 9 or 10 or 30 boxes, depending on sort of the class size, with other kids' faces. Like that's not a way where those types of learning or that type of learning can flourish or happen, for sure. But where tech can be helpful, one is, certainly as a way to, get a pulse on how things are so that institutions can be aware. So technologies that help to tie, how people are feeling and taking a poll and connecting that to student performance and, parent satisfaction. And really, again, like trying to give information and data in a digestible and actionable way to the leaders of schools to be able to then decide, how do I want to emphasize, what other changes can I make, within the school to support, this aspect of learning. And I think the mental health side as well, I think all too often, and certainly before, the last few years, mental health was something that folks in particular, perhaps at the younger ages, certainly like it just wasn't as much of a common thing to talk about. And I feel, and the data shows it, over the last couple of years, it's very much become commonplace or acceptable or more the norm to have discussions around mental health and wellness. And as mentioned with Hazel Health in our portfolio, they're really delivering on mental wellness and mental health support services for students. Certainly, some of those resources don't reside, in person at every single school. But if you're able to really identify and again work in partnership with the school nurse's office to get a pulse on how certain kids are doing or how certain classrooms or communities are doing, then that's an opportunity there for technology to be helpful to bring in the right again, conversation, the right therapy, the right support, the right professionals to really, help with some of these more difficult topics that perhaps, again, weren't fully addressed, even as recently as 5 years ago.
How would you describe different areas of EdTech? And can you just help our listeners have a better mental market map of EdTech or education technology?
Yeah, I think as you'd expect, like there are a lot of ways to slice and dice the market. I think the simplest way to think about this is around, along sort of certain vectors, right? So if you think about the learner life cycle, what you talked about before, preschool and younger, K through 12, higher ed, career, lifelong learning. So what stage is a particular company focused on? And sometimes it may not have to be just one, but oftentimes there is a specific focus for companies that are coming to market so they can better understand who they're targeting, who they're serving, how they're selling, and reaching the customer. A second is around what part of the value chain, if you will, they're delivering upon. So, for example, is this a technology solution that is serving administration? Is it focused on operations of an education institution? Or is it focused on teachers? Is it helping teachers with assessments? Or is it helping teacher with delivery and preparation of lesson planning? Or if you go further to think about, well, is this actually strictly a learner-focused solution? Is it a tutoring company that delivers either with the aid of technology or remotely or on specific topics? And so you can really kind of think about the value chain. And oftentimes that also has implications on go-to-market. Is it B2B, business to business? Is it, direct to consumer? Or, sometimes it can even be, through the schools itself to reach the end consumer as well. And so that's another sort of way to think about it. And then one last one I think that's important is really to think about what is the form of the solution. And so meaning, is it simply software? Is this a digital curriculum-based solution? Is it a consumer app? Is it perhaps a marketplace of goods technology, digital goods, or again services delivered remotely, or perhaps even a matching type of marketplace for tutors. We have a company called Preply that is focused on a language marketplace connecting tutors around the world to learners around the world, and then really supporting that interaction, for language learning. So that form of solution is another way to sort of think about, segmentation of the ed tech market, if you will.
What do you think are some of the most intriguing areas of ed tech right now that aspiring founders could focus on? And what kinds of startups are you hoping to invest in the next few years?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about some of the COVID-19 sort of related disruption to schooling. And that's really kind of produced a profound shock, as we talked about, to pre-K through 12, and then also certainly in workforce as well. But there's a lot that comes out of that in terms of helping to resolve and close some of those achievement gaps. Because not only has, as I mentioned, the performance of fourth graders, eighth graders reading and math sort of declined over the last few years, but the spread as well between the lowest performing and the highest performing has widened. And in large part, simply because of what we talked about before, how conducive was the environment to remote learning during that time. And for those that didn't have access to the right technology, had slower broadband internet access, perhaps didn't have the right sort of environment to be focused, there was more learning loss. And so not only have we, again, shifted down in terms of the average performance, but that sort of breadth, between top and bottom has also widened. And so that has led to, I think, a lot of challenges and opportunities for entrepreneurs to focus in again on addressing this learning loss, that gap. We have a company as well that's focused around the teacher shortage, as we talked about earlier, and around student mental health. And so all of those topics, I think, are very, 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 very pertinent in this moment in time, and really will be for decades to come. Companies that are also leveraging AI, of course, which we'll dive into, I'm sure, but there's an unbelievable amount of innovation happening, in education. And, AI, if you think about all the conversation that's happening around AI, education is often cited as, frankly, one of the core use cases. It's sort of given as an example of a core use case, for AI technology. And we're certainly seeing a lot of that right now. Upskilling and reskilling is absolutely, again, a really interesting and vibrant category for entrepreneurs to be diving into. There's again a ton of opportunity when you think about how quickly the job requirements are changing. And so if you think about the skills and the evolving environment that employees find themselves in, the World Economic Forum, oftentimes refers to a statistic that the average half-life of a skill is only about 5 years now. And so, to put that into context, anything that your kids are learning, or even that you and I are learning now, in about 5 to 7 years, we're going to have to continue to refresh, ourselves and to stay relevant in the workforce. And so, upskilling, reskilling is absolutely something that we're seeing a lot of innovation around, and closing that skills gap. And then the last thing I'll just say is that because, again, we have a global mandate and a global footprint, we're seeing opportunities for entrepreneurs around the world to really step up. And the opportunities that exist there oftentimes are a result of the local market dynamics, perhaps even, lack of infrastructure in certain regions. And I'm not just talking about, in this case, digital infrastructure, but also physical infrastructure. And so, if you think about Africa, as an example, World Economic Forum, estimates that young Africans are expected to make up, 42% of the world's youth in the next several years. And so think about the volume of people, of learners there that are going to be coming up. The physical infrastructure there just, cannot match, how the demand that is going to come. And so in that context, there's an opportunity to really help with technology through, a little bit of leapfrogging, kind of like what happened, in many places with mobile payments and other sectors. So we have a company there called ULesson, in Africa that is focused on educating the youth of Africa and focusing in on, again, leveraging technology and capturing high quality learning opportunities for young Africans, as they go through their K through 12 and now also with their higher education journey.
Let's move on and talk about AI, artificial intelligence, and the future of education. How do you think AI will change education, and how do you think AI can improve education?
There's a lot to dive into there, and I'm glad you asked the question. I think, as a technology, AI, of course, has been around for a long time, but, it's really over the last 18 months or 2 years now that it's taken, the conversation by storm, certainly with the LLMs and the rise of all the things that AI in general are capable of. And so if you think about education and AI, oftentimes where the mind sort of immediately goes is asking, a question and getting an immediate answer and just kind of going back and forth. And that's just sort of but one example. I think there's a broader context. If you kind of zoom out a little bit, there's certainly that element of, adaptive, personalized learning, giving you feedback, the ability to adjust content and curriculum to suit learners, as we've talked about before. If you think about also efficiencies and productivity, that's a huge opportunity for AI. So you can think about AI helping with grading, assessments, class preparation in terms of learning plans, and helping teachers really kind of deliver and develop, what they're going to be talking about to their students in a more efficient way. It can provide data insights, across a number of different data sources to help teachers better determine how best to help their students. Absolutely, a big sort of thread around AI is enhancing, teacher tools or teaching tools. So you can imagine, again, like we're seeing a lot of innovation around AI-powered tutors that are more engaging and interactive, and then getting into the analytics as well. And so identifying students that are potentially at risk earlier. All of these things, I think, are within the purview of how AI is going to change, education, and really sort of from a learning standpoint. We've been tracking a bit around how students and teachers are feeling. And there's a recent survey that the Walton Family Foundation had put out that sort of shared that 88% of teachers and 79% of students who have used, ChatGPT said it had a positive impact on learning. And then when you think about productivity gains that get opened up, there's a massive potential for efficiencies. The study that McKinsey had put out talking about Gen AI tools projected to unlock $120 to $230 billion in potential productivity gains across education. So that would put it as a percent of total industry revenue higher than really every other sector, including healthcare, banking, telecom, in terms of efficiency gains, except for software and tech itself. And to kind of put that into context, what does that mean? That means that there's some estimates out there certainly that have suggested that teachers could reallocate upwards of 1.5 days out of a teaching week towards supporting student learning by intelligently adopting AI to really, again, reduce the number of amount of time spent on more administrative details. And so this is really where we see opportunities as well to augment and supplement, teachers, is by unlocking more time for them and allowing them and giving them the information to spend that additional time as well to help each student more specifically, where it's needed. And I'll give you one more example. Higher ed is sort of a great case study as well for opportunity with AI. I mean, there's a ton of departments. If you think about any higher ed institution with various departments spread out across campus, I mean, there are a ton of departments and business processes at every institution of learning. And AI has, the potential to generate productivity gains in, marketing and enrollment, or financial aid, career services, student records, student success and retention, as we talked about. And so we definitely envision and see a wave of efficiency gains over the next, 5 to 10 plus years. through AI.
I can definitely see how AI could have some really benefits in efficiency and eliminating administrative work in education, particularly with overstressed teachers, overworked teachers, and a teacher shortage.
Right.
On the other hand, I also feel like there's a little bit of a dystopian view I could come up with of,
For sure.
The idea of AI being somehow responsible for educating humans. Just for example, I'm afraid of a world where AI is grading humans. I can imagine that AI would give Hemingway a B- in writing, for example,
Right.
and that kind of human creativity and innovation in artistic endeavors, et cetera, might not mesh so well. I don't know. Maybe that's just my fears. But what do you think about that kind of idea of the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the flip side of the coin for sure, right? It's that for any new technology that comes, there's really have to be some thoughtful approaches to how you implement them and how you leverage them, how you use them. And some of that's in the control of institutions and teachers and educators, and some of that is not, in the sense that students are going to find and identify ways to leverage consumer-oriented AI solutions for helping them with homework, as an example. Pretty obvious concern for sure, right? And so that also, frankly, is an opportunity. Can maybe circling this and tying this back together, what you're saying earlier about where are the interesting opportunities for entrepreneurs, because this is going to happen. It is happening right now, and so educators, education institutions, will need to again evolve to the realities of what's happening, in the outside world or in the world writ large, and what students have access to. And so how do I sort of see that playing out? Well, I think, again, there's got to be a focus on, critical thinking and creativity. And I say that both because when students graduate, will need to have that higher order skill or that higher level thinking. And that's really what employers are going to be focused on, as we go into an increasingly, again, AI-driven, world. It's not just about accessing or memorizing facts and, regurgitating, numbers or specific details. It's really about, how do you think about it? And I say that not only for, hey, this is what students will need to know, but also this is how education institutions and educators are going to also focus what they're teaching, because it is much harder, for educators and students to say, okay, well, AI is going to supplement this project-based learning where you have to collaboratively work together with 3 or 4 other students on a project, and try to think about opportunities for solving this problem. Now, of course, there's always going to be some solutions and some support that can be had through AI, but ultimately, again, even the change that's required to craft what that assignment is something that education institutions are going to need to think about and are thinking about, today, right? So that's certainly one aspect of it. I do think that, again, in this environment, there's going to be more around digital literacy and the curriculum that focuses in on what is AI, and even teaching kids how to use AI, because again, this is a reality that the students and that we are all in right now, which is that these tools are available to us. So instead of shying away from them, we should really sort of think about how can we use them most effectively, where is it most appropriate, and how do we use them in a way where it doesn't also cause us to lose sight of some of the basic building blocks of learning, and so that kids still have that understanding of what is actually happening, and that, again, active creative thinking, in a world of where AI seemingly can respond with very, very thoughtful responses, right? And so that judgment is going to be really, really important. And I think to your point about the Hemingway grading as an example, I'd say that for all of this, there are going to be elements of human in the loop, and so it's not to suggest that AI is going to grade everything, and teachers are going to just take it at face value. But certainly, I think much like 30 years ago, there was technology to help teachers, auto grade even if it was uninspiring with things like scantrons and bubble charts and things of that, bubble grids and things of that nature. There's always that important overlay of teachers being involved to understand, what is it that students conceptually, are either learning or haven't yet quite grasped, and to focus that teaching on that. And so I think there is a lot, that educators and institutions learning are going to have to do in order to avoid that dystopian future that you're referring to. And that again in itself is an opportunity. I mean, we're seeing entrepreneurs that are coming out. We have a company called HonorLock, that's focused around again ensuring the integrity of some of these assessments. And so it's absolutely critical, right? You don't want rampant cheating. You don't want students that are sort of showcasing seemingly the ability of understanding certain concepts, but it's really AI in the background, right? And so these are all, I think, opportunities, for entrepreneurs to help, use technology, to support educators and institutions, in this regard as well.
How do you think education needs to change in order to prepare people and prepare students for a world in which AI is very present?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a lot of what I just talked about in terms of, what are some of those changes? I mean, it's up leveling. So certainly not just stopping at the teaching of basic, concepts and sort of recall, if you will, memorization. If you go back 30 or 40 years, there are a lot of kids that were competing in, spelling bee. I mean, there still are today, frankly. But, I like to use that example because in many ways, there's a lot of discipline and other certainly, I think learning goals that are achieved just through the process of doing that. But the act itself of recalling, how certain words, are spelled, that has much less value today than it did 30 years ago when you didn't have spell check, when you didn't have AI, when you didn't have all these technologies. And now the real value is not learning how to spell the word, but it's really learning, what does the word mean? How do I use it most impactfully? Where is it appropriate for me to, again, sort of how can I access the right technology to check if this word is spelled correct? So there's a lot more involved. And I think I just use that as like a very simplistic example because I think in this, what's happening now is there's going to be, again, more and more of a premium placed on, what it is that students are doing or as employees, how do we solve problems? I mean, I think even more recently, I think it was, Jensen at NVIDIA that was saying, well, maybe the coding for coding's sake isn't going to be as important in the future either, because that part of it may be, accomplished in, again, large part by a co-pilot or an AI, but really understanding what is the problem that you're trying to solve. So that sort of second and third order, thought process is going to be more and more of a premium. So those are the types of things, again, that I think that, the educational institutions are going to need to evolve to meet the reality of the world ahead of us. And by the way, again, as I mentioned, I think there is going to be a significant amount of new curriculum and professional development that needs to, be delivered in order for educators to be able to teach our, young people, about all of these things as well.
And I know he's kind of touched on it before in some ways, but how are the rise of large language models, LLMs like ChatGPT, affecting your investment decisions moving forward?
Yeah, fundamentally, it hasn't really changed our investment process in the sense that, our investment process, when we evaluate opportunities is really focused around, the founder, what's their experience, what do they bring to the table? What's their fit to the opportunity that they've identified? What is the problem that they're identifying? What's that market opportunity? How are they delivering on that innovation? What's the technology underlying, and what are the outcomes? As I mentioned earlier, what are the outcomes that are being delivered? So, in a world where there are, large language models, none of that sort of changes that evaluation criteria, that framework. I think where it has changed is if you sort of double click within each of those and think about, what does that mean? And so for AI and LLMs, like, it really has changed, how quickly competition can emerge. It does also change in many respects how you think about moat or defensibility, for a particular solution. And, for every company that we're now talking to, there's also certainly a question around, how are you leveraging AI, and, how are your competitors, going to use AI as well? And are there new ways to approach a problem or a market with AI that couldn't have been done before, right? I think you've probably had many conversations about this when things came online, or you had mobile. It's not just about bringing online to the phone. There are things that the phone can do, or being untethered, where you can deliver different types of solutions. And I think we're at the very early stages of that right now, but certainly there's always the question of, well, what else could you be doing with an AI native solution? But ultimately, it is a tool, it is a technology approach. There's going to be more interactivity. What's sort of considered just the norm and table stakes certainly has sort of risen, because I think a lot of LLMs do sort of offer the ability for solutions to have more engagement, drive more interactivity. And so I just kind of give you an example of what I mean by the criteria hasn't changed, but double clicking some of the details and realities that may change. I mean, over the last couple of years, there's certainly a class of tutoring businesses in the education market that were coming up and really kind of embracing the reality that individuals are much more comfortable now with texting. And so the idea for some of these companies was that, hey, we can do this with a chat-based offering so that one tutor can really provide support to multiple students concurrently with a little bit of a lag, but through text. And historically, again, like, that was really pitched as a more cost-effective solution. Now, there's always been questions of, is it, more efficacious, which, again, we don't subscribe to, meaning that we do think that sort of the in-person, or at least the synchronous learning is in many ways superior. But now that you see these LLMs coming, I mean, those types of chat-based tutoring companies are effectively rendered extinct in many ways, right? Because now you have an even more responsive solution that is premised on the comfort level of students, texting. And of course, an LLM, does have access to a wider, variety. It's just more instant and comprehensive. And of course, there's questions sometimes on the quality of those responses. But, for all intents and purposes, it's very difficult to ask somebody to pay for a chat-based tutoring service now that's powered by humans than by AI. So that's again, just a simple example of, okay, well, the evaluation criteria hasn't changed, but the advantage that you thought you had, or that those companies thought they had, for that result of the chat base, as one example, is that, that can erode pretty quickly. And so we're constantly now thinking about, how does LLMs impact what can be delivered, what's the moat, and what's the sort of art of the possible in terms of solutions to a problem.
It seemed like right when ChatGPT came out, a lot of startup founders were trying to create products that sort of repackaged it, maybe with a little bit extra training around a particular vertical. It didn't really seem like there's a lot of defensible moat there. It wasn't even necessarily clear that their product was that much better than ChatGPT itself.
Right.
What are sort of the opportunities for smaller startups that haven't, that are trying to kind of compete with these giant tech incumbents that have these large language models? What are the opportunities for these smaller startups to leverage AI to really utilize this time of disruption and kind of capture a great market share for a real opportunity that has real value for customers?
Yeah, I think in many ways, thinking about, again, AI as a technology, as a tool, and not as the call it be all end all, right? Because unless you are, like you said, like an open AI, you really are trying to solve specific problems for specific stakeholders. And so in many respects, we think the opportunities certainly arise when founders understand exactly the problem that the teacher is facing or the student is facing, and really sort of is tailored to the problem in front of them that they're solving, right? As opposed to being just a generic chat-based system. Now, you understand as a company exactly how a teacher is sort of addressing or thinking about their classroom, or thinking about the data, or thinking about all the ecosystem of vendors where data may exist, as an example. And that's not something that's immediately obvious. I mean, there's always opportunities to insert and tie together into the workflow, of a process. And again, I'm just using teachers as an example, but I think for a company that intimately understands, the teacher sort of workflow around something, for example, like assessments, then there's going to be an opportunity to create, a solution that is sticky, that a generic, LLM again, doesn't sort of solve. And I'll give you an example of that. So we have an investment in a company called Amira Learning. And Amira Learning is essentially doing oral fluency assessment for younger kids in elementary school. And so that means reading passages that Amira is, serving up on their program, and having students essentially orally read those sentences or stories. And the Amira will essentially evaluate in real time, whether or not the student is pronouncing the words the correct way, or they'll ask certain questions and determine whether or not the comprehension is fully there. And then they'll also serve some immediate remediation, but all the while, it's gathering data on where, Sasha or where Ian, needs additional support, and provides that to the teacher. Now, there's a lot of AI that's embedded in, that solution, because it's all about understanding and recognizing the natural language processing. But it's delivered in a way that's in the workflow for a teacher. And it's serving it up to the teacher and making it actionable. And so the packaging and what's surrounding, the AI technology that's driving that assessment is very, very critical to the success of Amira, and frankly, to the success of the teacher that's, using Amira. And so that's just kind of one example, again, of what I mean when I say that, understanding sort of the intimately understanding the problem, intimately sort of understanding, what that workflow, essentially looks like, or what that individual or institution is going through, and then delivering that solution that is exactly mapped out and catered to, helping, increasing efficiency, or driving, learning outcomes, or both, frankly.
What do you think are some of the most intriguing opportunities right now for aspiring founders interested in AI for EdTech, education technology right now? And what are kind of some of the most interesting kinds of AI EdTech startups you're seeing recently?
I think there's a lot of opportunity, for entrepreneurs that are thinking about this category. And again, as I mentioned, if you talk to anybody, you listen to anybody who's talking about AI education, comes up as like a top 3 use case, for AI, right? And so I think there's opportunities around data analytics, teaching and learning, curriculum design, meaning, again, leveling of, content or curriculum to, better specifically meet, a student where they're at. I think there's broader student services that could leverage AI, certainly as well. We've seen institutions of learning that have been implemented, different types of AI chatbots, certainly in that regard. I mean, again, some of these are like fairly straightforward, and others are more involved in the workflow, as I talked about. So there is a lot. We've seen a number of businesses, again, emerge around tutoring or content creation, tracking and feedback. But But it really also, I would just sort of say, touching on the point that you made earlier, which is that, it does have to be a solution and an offering in the market where you do feel like it can't just be, immediately replicated by somebody else that's going to put a thin wrapper around, an LLM and deliver it tomorrow. I mean, I think in many regards, this is a great time as a consumer, as an institution, as an education institution, as a teacher, because there are so many solutions right now that actually do add, a lot of value and are very valuable. But I think that's a different sort of consideration than to say, hey, as an entrepreneur, am I going to start a company and really kind of invest my time and energy, recruit others to build a business that can kind of withstand and scale and withstand the test of competition, if you will, over time? Like that's a almost different sort of question to answer. But right now, as a user, I mean, it's a really exciting time. There's just a lot of different solutions that are coming to market that even if they all look very similar in many respects, as a consumer or as a user, as a learner, they're all actually quite helpful. And we're also seeing strong use cases on the enterprise side, by the way, as well. Not to just kind of focus on traditional kind of K through 12, but like there are absolutely AI tools emerging right now around recruiting, around talent assessment, around dynamic upskilling. We have an investment in a company called Workera that's really focusing on what they call kind of precision upskilling. It's using AI to really kind of generate assessments, around a whole variety of disciplines, including AI itself, to help a company, again, take stock of what their employees are familiar with, what they're capable of, what they know, and also what they need to learn and what are the appropriate paths of learning paths and resources for them to go, upskill, right? And again, that's an example of, a company that is, very much, entrenched and understands the problem statement, as well as how enterprises are thinking about it. And they recently signed, a very large contract with Accenture, example to be used within Accenture and also to, customers and clients of Accenture, as well as, a couple of, groups within the government. So they have a contract, for example, with the Air Force. So these things really take a lot of different forms. And, if you go back to the earlier question, Sasha, that you asked around how do you sort of segment the market, every one of those market segments, I think there's going to be significant opportunity for AI to make an impact. It's certainly not just sort of K through 12 and not just a typical, ask a question and get an answer from ChatGPT that we all probably just think about almost as a knee-jerk response right now to what does AI do in education.
Before we move on to some personal questions and the bonus round, is there anything else you want to say about education, technology, EdTech, the future of education, or AI in education, or what the best way for founders is to contact you?
Yeah. So probably not surprising, but we're long-term bullish on education and technology. I mean, I think there's just really a lot that we believe technology can do to help support existing education system, to help learners inside and outside of school, to help enterprises, when you think about the future of work and employee, reskilling and upskilling. And so I think the last 5 years in particular have been incredibly dynamic. Certainly, I mean, I think, COVID obviously in many ways was terrible, but within the context of education, it did sort of plant the seeds in many ways for the next generation of innovation. And what I mean by that is, there was a ton of investment that happened in infrastructure. When we were all thrust into COVID in 2020, it became pretty apparent that different communities, different countries, different regions of the world had varying levels of infrastructure. And so the amount of infrastructure investment that went in around the world, I think, was pretty tremendous, and again elevated sort of that base. And there's still, frankly, a lot more to do. But the amount of infrastructure investment is helpful, absolutely. The familiarity, with solutions, and just, having everyone, almost overnight or over the last, 4 to 5 years become digital natives of sorts, is also really, really important to, again, like paving the way for adoption for future, future solutions. And interestingly, because it wasn't perfect, because again, we just all kind of got, shoved into the deep end of, digital learning overnight, there's a lot of opportunities that became also very obvious, where, hey, this could be better, or that experience could be better, or, maybe we could deliver this in a different way. And we're seeing right now entire wave of entrepreneurs who are being drawn to the sector because they themselves now experience the problem, right? So, I mean, I think oftentimes, Sasha, you probably have heard this in other conversations, but the most, oftentimes the best way to launch a business is to have experienced a problem that you couldn't quite find a solution to solve, right? And so I think in many ways, again, now the market has become more readily sort of available to EdTech, and now we're having entrepreneurs that are coming from Google, from Meta, from all the Microsoft, from all these larger companies as well as smaller companies from other sectors, kind of being drawn to the sector. And so, for us, like as we sort of think about the next 5 years, the next 10, 20 years, I mean, the future sort of long-term secular trend for this education vertical, like in many ways, is like it's very much inevitable in the minds that there's going to be more use of technology than less. Like we're not going back to a world where everyone is carrying 500-page textbooks in their backpack and walking from classroom to classroom. Like we're not going back to that. And with the teacher shortages, with the learning loss, with everything that's happening in the world, and with the constant changing that's going on in the world around us, the importance of how our young people and adults ourselves are learning, it's going to lean more and more on technology. And that doesn't mean, again, that we're replacing people or we're not sort of incorporating the human element. It's really that where technology can be helpful to unlocking time for us to have that more engaged human interaction, or to have more focused attention on where learners need to spend time and improve on. I mean, that's where technology really is going to shine. And we just think that that's an exciting world. I mean, I can't even imagine, again, you asked a question earlier about like, what's it going to look like in 10 to 20 years? I mean, I'm really excited actually about where it's going to go, assuming that we all take the right steps to avoid the dystopian, future that you also painted, which again, like I think as we all navigate this pretty, thoughtfully, hopefully as a society, that, we'll be able to do that. So, and just in terms of how people can get in touch with me, always welcome sort of new ideas and conversations. My email is ian@owlvc, so ian@owlvc.com. So welcome any outreach. That's probably the easiest way.
Let's move on to some personal questions. Tell me a little about your personal and career journey, and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I grew up in Houston as a son of immigrants. I went to public school throughout my K through 12 education. And I was fortunate enough to go to Stanford, during the internet boom of the late 90s. That really, in many ways planted the seed, for tech and entrepreneurship, in my mind. And, it was a very much, I would say, non-linear path. I did a lot of exploration, growing up, coming out of Stanford. I ultimately left my graduate program in engineering a little bit early to help launch a startup. I spent a bit of time as well doing consulting, at Bain. I even dabbled in news media and investment banking along the way. And so, for me, it was really, a period of discovery, I think, in my, call it 20s. I even did a short stint actually, at the NBA, as a basketball fan. And so that was a ton of fun, and scratched at a potential itch of mine as well to go into potentially the sports industry. But I started investing about 20 years ago, in tech, and about 16 years ago or so in education and tech. When I saw an opportunity to help not only learners, but also build really, really scaled companies that would have an impact on the next generation. And so, I started out slightly later stage. I was part of Silver Lake Partners in Fund 1 and Fund 2. And then prior to Owl, spent a good period of time, about almost 10 years at Warburg Pincus, which is more of a growth equity firm. But every experience, for me, really kind of represented an interest or passion. And EdTech, as I kind of progressed in my career, really captured my interest and was something I wanted to spend more and more time on. There's actually, kind of going back to the beginning, an experience that was actually pretty formative for me, which was that in high school, going to college, I had three brothers. So there's four of us. And, you talked about the rising tuition, for higher education. And, that's something that we faced as well. We didn't have sort of the ability to go, again, to all these different schools and pay without having that be stressful for our family. And so one of the things that we did was really actively apply for scholarships back then. And so I actually had written a book along with my brothers on how to apply to scholarships. And it was in part inspired by the fact that a lot of different families had started to ask us about, what is our process? How do we think about it? How do you sort of go about, identifying these? And it was a book that was actually endorsed by Stanford's, admissions department and director, and was picked up and distributed to, all of the counselors in the Houston Independent School District, which was, I think, like the fourth or fifth largest school district at the time. But that really planted a seed, for my interest in this sort of intersection between, education and impact and business and finance. And, I feel like in many regards, I've sort of come full circle and I'm blessed to sort of be doing what I'm doing now at Owl with, people that folks that I enjoy personally and respect professionally. And it really kind of combines not only, investing, education, entrepreneurship in many ways as we scale the firm. And, we even have a few former and current NBA players and others that allowed me to sort of marry my interest in sports with everything I'm doing today, as well. So it's been quite a journey, and again, feel pretty blessed to be able to find a spot that allows me to combine all of these things together.
Was there anything unexpected about your career path?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, all of it, was unexpected in some regard. I mean, I didn't even know growing up in Houston that an industry of venture capital really even existed. Back then, I was not familiar with finance, at all, or really startups. Houston growing up in the 80s and 90s was, all about oil and gas and medical industry. Those were in many ways some of the larger industries in town. And again, my mom being a nurse and my father being an engineer, chemical engineer, participated in both of those. So to me, it was all about exploration. I mean, in high school, if you asked me what I wanted to do, I wanted to be a sports doctor. And so, as I went to Stanford, I think that experience really opened up my eyes, to what technology was, where it was going, captured my interest in that and entrepreneurship. I really got exposure actually to, the world of investing at some level and even finance, through an internship that, I was fortunate enough to get through an organization, actually a nonprofit organization called SEO, Sponsors for Educational Opportunities. It's a 50-year-old plus organization now. Actually, I did it, went through the internship program for SEO careers about almost over 25 years ago now at this point. And it's been great. I mean, that exposed me to, again, finance, and also investing. And that also is a whole nother story. I mean, that did also come full circle. So I now sit on the advisory board for SEO as a nonprofit. helping them continue to impact lives through education and creating opportunities for underrepresented folks. And so, my takeaway, I guess, just in general on my own personal career journey, anyways, is that it's always important to really not get pigeonholed in one sort of path, and really continue to experiment and expose and become aware of different career lanes and different career opportunities to discover what excites you most. Or and certainly that's what I did. I think there are certainly people that are fortunate enough early in life to know exactly what they want to do, lean into that and love it, and spend their entire career doing that. That wasn't me. That wasn't my journey. But certainly, I do think that, even when I talk to my own children, or think about, how, I'll have those conversations in the future when they're at that point. It really is about, again, being open, embracing the unexpected, which in many ways, I think, if you come back to what we were talking about, is going to be, more and more true in my mind, right? With half-life of skills, with the new technologies. Certainly 10 years ago, there weren't careers of people being prompt engineers. 20 years ago, you wouldn't imagine us sitting here doing a podcast, over the internet. In 20 to 30 years from now, there are going to be all kinds of careers that we can probably not even really kind of imagine fully today, right? And so that's sort of my takeaway in terms of my own journey.
All right, let's move on to the bonus round. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
All right, what really drives and motivates you?
Yeah, I sounds cliche, but I think making a difference in small ways and big ways really does drive and motivate me. And so, I enjoy one-on-one conversations and collaborating with others to help them achieve their goals. In many ways, that is the role of a venture capitalist, is to help entrepreneurs in any way that we can, not only with funding, of course, but, as a sector-specific fund, of course, we believe that we're delivering a lot of other things, to help entrepreneurs achieve their vision and dream for their company. And so I really enjoy that, sort of dynamic on a one-to-one basis. And when I say big ways, I just think about, again, like more broadly as a firm, we're incredibly motivated by the impact that our companies are making around the world for all stakeholders. And so, again, I think it's worth checking out our outcomes report on our website. But to give you a sense of scale, our companies are serving almost 600 million learners across 240 plus countries. And that includes, as well, over 40,000 higher ed institutions and 930,000 employers, and, creating over, 45,000 jobs, right? And so through our fund vehicle, through, our companies that we're investing in, we have the ability to, and the good fortune of being able to reach and impact, in a big way as well. So that's kind of what I mean by small ways and big ways, the day-to-day, but then also, through our portfolio, making big impact.
What excites and inspires you?
Yeah, I really enjoy watching, an entrepreneur to take an idea, and have that idea sort of take root and scale, again, to impact all these lives, millions around the world. And that's, to be honest, that's one of the most exciting and inspirational things. And again, to have a hand in that in a small way as an investor and partner, certainly makes it even more gratifying.
What's something about you that most people wouldn't expect?
Yeah, I don't know if it's something unexpected or not, since we talked a little bit about it, but I'm a huge basketball fan. I grew up in Houston, watching the Rockets win back-to-back championships when I was a junior and senior in high school and in the mid-90s, and was fortunate enough to win a scholarship from Hakeem Olajuwon, for community service, actually, in Houston. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I spent some time as well exploring sports as a potential career path and worked at the NBA. And, in the end, I've been pretty fortunate to still be connected to the NBA and the work that I'm doing. We have a number of former and current NBA players as investors in our funds, and we've also been able to find some really interesting and impactful ways to get them involved with our portfolio companies, as well. And so, I was able to connect Jeremy Lin, with one of our portfolio companies called Lingo Ace, which is delivering Mandarin education and tutoring to kids, and something that Jeremy was very passionate about. And he ultimately became their global ambassador, espousing the importance of learning languages and cultures. We also had introduction and connection for Brandon Scarlett, who's an NFL player, and he really brought a couple of our portfolio companies into communities that he works closely with up in Portland, and that's involving both financial literacy, but also I mentioned earlier Amira Learning, and he brought Amira Learning into a couple of the schools there that he works closely with to promote reading, at a young age as well. The big sort of tagline at some level is that, as a young kid, you're really sort of learning how to read so that later on, you can, read to learn. But the NBA, sports, all of that, kind of growing up was a big sort of personal interest and passion of mine. And it's been fun to be able to connect that with all the work that I've been doing and enjoyment in education as well, in tech, obviously.
What's some advice you would give your younger self?
Yeah, I think just enjoying the journey and knowing that every experience, no matter how sort of non-linear it may seem, is all part of the tapestry. And looking back, I do find myself sort of drawing upon, each and every one of my personal and professional experiences, in relationships still today. So I think just sort of appreciating that and recognizing that, is something that I would tell my younger self.
When you're gone from this earth, what would you like to be remembered for?
Pretty simple things, and this is, what I share with my kids all the time, which is just, treat people with respect, be kind, and try to use, your gifts, whatever those may be, to make a difference, right? As we talked about. And, I hope that's how people think of me, today, even. No need to wait until I'm gone.
All right. Well, Ian, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a really great conversation.
A lot of fun. Thanks, Sasha.